Hi there, it's Katie Crysdale here from Lakeview Aquatic Consultants. I'm here today with Courtney Domoney. We are going to be chatting about a news article that I saw on the internet a couple of weeks ago, and I was really perplexed in terms of what it meant for the aquatic industry. So, welcome, Courtney.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in aquatics, what you are doing when you're not here recording with me?
Live in Regina, Saskatchewan. I have been a pool rat for my whole life, but got interested in lifeguarding and life saving and teaching swimming lessons. So I started working as a lifeguard, worked in a few kind of aquatic areas, including with the Life Saving Society in Saskatchewan for a while. Now I'm in a different position, but I still very much involved at the pool and with kind of kids program deliveries in other areas, even at a pool in Saskatchewan this weekend. We just wrapped up teaching a course. So very much still hanging out at the pool. I don't think the pool can get rid of me.
I was going to say it's very rare for somebody to cut off the pool cold. There's usually something, like you said, either still teaching leadership courses, still getting called out to help with thorny topics or other perspectives. That's a really good tie-in to what we were chatting a little bit offline. And that was about this article I had posted on Instagram because I was just completely perplexed whether the headline was real or if it was a bit clickbaity. So the headline was from the Edmonton Journal, which is one of the primary traditional newspapers, legacy newspapers in Edmonton, Alberta. And the headline from July 20th of 2024 states, "Sex assaults at pools and rec centers can rise in summer, warn Edmonton police." In the simplest terms, if a child or youth feels someone engaged with them or made contact with them in a non-consensual way, we encourage reporting to center staff. So I completely agree, but I was confused as to the need to make this type of announcement, to make this type of headline. And I was wondering, is it tip of spear? Is it a bigger problem that I'm completely unaware of because I'm not on the deck much anymore? Or if it was a slow news week and people are coming up with articles to come up with articles. So what are your thoughts on this topic?
For the record, by no means an expert in this area. And while I don't have necessarily any statistics to share, I think I would agree with the concept of what the article is mostly trying to tell, in that I don't know, again, necessarily if statistic wise we're necessarily seeing an increase versus what used to happen back in the day. But one of the things I know I've been involved with increasing reporting, and we always preach to staff, it's better to report things, put it on an incident report. If your spidey senses are saying, something's not right, to investigate. I think generally we are seeing an increase in events being reported for sure. Whether or not they were always happening and we just didn't report them before, I'm not sure. I do think our community has changed a little bit in terms of some staff don't necessarily feel as comfortable going up to people as they used to anymore. I feel like as a broad statement, we are not necessarily as easy to just chat up our neighbor as we used to be. Again, as a whole, very broad statement. Created a bit of divide between people, and so people are less likely to kind of just assume positive intent. And so, again, whether or not some of these incidents or reporting are founded or unfounded, I think that I get a sense of feeling that there's a lot more suspicion between people than there ever used to be.
And I think to talk a little bit about what I experienced back in the early days of aquatics in the early 2000s, 2010s. I mean, I can only speak to the facilities that I worked at and the communities that I was working in, which, like you've been saying, not every community has the same statistics or the same underlying patterns. But when I worked in downtown Toronto, like literally downtown Toronto, I'm not naive. We certainly did have incidents where we had to call police to investigate situations, whether it was alleged voyeurism, whether it was alleged incidents in our summer camp programs. And I was never in those capacities at a management level to know where they progressed. And typically it would be taken offsite by police in terms of their investigation. And then even in community pools I've worked at here in Alberta, we've had numerous incidents, whether I was on deck or the supervisor receiving one of those incident report forms that you mentioned, of either an allegation of leering or some sort of allegation of an incident in a less visible space like a steam room or a sauna or a hot tub with the jets going. So these things definitely happen. I'm not of the opinion that these things don't happen, but I guess for me, and it's hard to speak without statistics. We don't have statistics. But what are you experiencing in your staff training or hearing from the guards on deck? Do you think there is not underlying conditions, but that this is just happening more often because there's higher usage, or it is just the better reporting that people are looking out for these things?
Like the other piece too is, as a community, we spread information way more than we ever used to. Like I know in Regina, it has, like Regina Police Service has a very public posting and sharing of people that get charged. And when people are released from jail, they'll make public notices and where they live. That kind of, the change in how we share information, how public that is, has shifted a lot. Like even when I think about when I started lifeguarding in 2010 to now, how I received information as a lifeguard is very different than now as a manager, how I share information to my lifeguards. The quantity of information has changed, the quality of information has changed. And so I think our staff are more aware of what's actually going on in the community. It's not necessarily anymore just hearsay of, oh, we're in a rougher neighborhood. There's probably, rougher folks around. Now it's like, hey, I can tell you the 5 people that have charges that live within the, however large of radius around this building.
And that's so interesting for me to hear because it aligns with what I had heard through my husband's work previously in terms of security and loss prevention and the level of detailed records that they would keep in terms of people banned from the premises or people who had issues at other franchise locations, that information was shared internally. But as a layperson who's not on the deck every day anymore, it's interesting because I know there's been so many conversations just generally about privacy and what information is disclosed. And so I find it, I think it's good that awareness is happening, but I wouldn't have thought that there would be that increased information because sometimes people are so concerned about who knows what and who has the right to that information.
Technology wise, like I think there's facilities that have security cameras in places where before, you were lucky if you had 5 running taps at your little hole in the wall outdoor pool, right? So the technology that's actually on site in some of these locations has shifted as we've replaced some of our aging infrastructure. And the things that have come along with that is we are in some ways more aware of what's going on at our building.
And I think to your point about the predominance of security cameras, I know in Canada it seems to still be less popular compared to places like the United States where more facilities are willing to post those cameras kind of as their own safety policy to protect themselves against lawsuits. Culturally in Canada, it does seem to be the case that it's more at private facilities. I see at high-end hotels or resorts or very large water parks that are using those cameras, but it's still not very socially acceptable. And certainly we see increased signage in change rooms, policies in terms of people taking smartphones and selfies in areas where, there is probably a presumption of privacy, there might be nudity. And so really shifting, I think, in the last 15 years as to, 15 years ago, I wouldn't walk into a change room with a smartphone or a cell phone, but now everybody has one in their hand to control their podcast player, to control their, video that they're watching. It's a completely different time.
Yeah, when I first started as an aquatic programmer, that would have been like 2019. I remember that was one of my very first big projects was I was researching other municipalities and what cell phone policies were. Were any areas allowing cell phones in the change rooms? and really just kind of looking into that, because we were seeing that a little bit back then, and more in the context of like, people were having FaceTime conversations and they just continue their conversation into the change room, but then you have a video going in the change room. So there was no like, often there was no like malice intent behind it, but the behavior itself was still happening, and the possibility obviously is there. So
Well, and I remember a couple years ago, I believe this was through Athletic Business, which is more a general recreation and fitness account I follow on Facebook. And they showcased an incident at a chain fitness facility. I can't recall what it was, but it was a big US multi site gym chain where it was something like that. The woman was taking selfies of herself for her Instagram account, and she had enough followers that people noticed that there was basically a naked larger woman in the background that she was making fun of in her Instagram stories. And I like to think that was a bit of a moment where people suddenly stopped and realized that, hey, it's not just about my selfie. It is that there's other people around. And not every change room, even the change rooms I've gone into, some people are more diligent than others. I saw this really great PSA I'll link in the show notes from Swim England, talking about, safeguarding phones in change rooms for swim practice and things like that, that it might start out being fun, but, it's a very thin line where people are wearing their clothes or not.
On the article that you had shared just around like summer, and does it become busier in summer, like what makes summer different? I feel like there's more a lot of places have more outdoor pools than indoor pools, and so when you obviously double your offerings of aquatic environments, it would make sense that you would have an increase in incidents. And I also just think risk wise, I feel like it would make sense. It probably, and I'm inferring, but it probably feels a little easier to go to an environment that's outside, doesn't really have a fancy front desk, is run by a 16-year-old cashier. That's a much less more intimidating environment than going to an aquatic center where it's very formal and there's lots of things going on and there's lots of people. So again, I have no actual data to back that up, but I did think about that in terms of the article with summer, like if you're a person that maybe is trying to go somewhere or do something that you're not supposed to be doing, I feel like an outdoor pool space might be a more enticing environment than like an indoor facility, just again in that there's maybe perceived less risk in that space.
I absolutely agree with you. I know the problems we would often have at the one facility I worked at in Toronto. Statistically, it seemed to happen a lot more on Sundays, and Sundays was, arguably the B or the C team, those of us who are lowest on the totem pole in terms of seniority. It was the least desirable shift, but it was also the most common shift in terms of lots of families, lots of dropping kids, and just a very busy, chaotic public swim where it would be difficult to keep an eye on everything happening in the bleachers and the seating area around the pool as compared to a normal Tuesday afternoon when you kind of knew all your regulars and you knew your regular behaviors and people sitting in those areas. So the genesis for me of this conversation was I just was so surprised. Like, awareness is important, and I think these things should be in the media because not everybody thinks of these things. But I guess I want to hear from people if they're watching this video and what their experiences are in their community. If they're noticing, is it increased reporting like you're saying, or is there potentially also increased occurrences based on some of the factors, like you said, where people are just less willing to have a discussion because they fear confrontation. They may lack some of those interaction skills from the last 4 or 5 years of COVID, where they're not de-escalating a small situation. My direct experience with just reading the news the last few weeks since we started talking about this, I've come across a number of articles in different states, US states. There's been, one that comes to mind, man accused of assaulting children swimming in MIT pool. A woman accused of groping young boys at pool claimed she was saving herself. Like, it just seems like there's more headlines, but to your point, is it more people are interested, more people are paying attention? I don't know.
Work a lot in the inclusion realm as well, and it's tricky. Sometimes we have these conversations where, we want to create an inclusive environment where everyone is welcome, and we want to be as barrier free as possible. The flip of opening our doors so freely is the risk of what we're inviting in. So obviously this is not something that we want to invite in, that we want to have happen in any of our spaces. But yeah, trying to navigate this line of how do we provide an inclusive environment where people are welcome to be in our space, and we want to have, like I said, I feel like I talk about positive intent all the time, but we want to believe people have positive intent, but we know that isn't always actually the case. Trying to figure out how we navigate this tricky line between positive intent, not positive intent, arming our staff with enough tools to make smart decisions and intervene in the right time, while also not assuming that everyone is a bad human.
Something that's so much a part of the National Lifeguard Program, where we're basically teaching new lifeguards to profile, but we need to do so in a way that's appropriate based on what did you actually witness or what is actually happening. We don't want to make assumptions for something that we haven't witnessed, and we want to give people the benefit of the doubt, and we do want to, get more information. But I know certainly here in Alberta, some of the communities like Red Deer and Lethbridge that are really struggling with the opioid crisis, the mental health crisis, costs of living, homelessness, all of these individuals or populations that are living on the precipice, where it's been a really challenging couple years since COVID and the economy, what have you. It completely makes sense to me what you're saying, that it could be increased reporting. But then in my opinion, I also wonder if it's increased occurrences, not because the pool's necessarily any busier, but because the potential access of these facilities is increasing by people who may need other amenities, and then they end up in the pool, or they end up using, a shared bathroom in the lobby, or a shower area that is split between the pool and a community room, or what have you, that there's just more people wandering around these spaces. And maybe it's education, maybe it's surveillance or awareness, or maybe it's just what we're going to be dealing with now.
We chatted with some pool architects from out in the Lower Mainland, and they talked a lot about the universal washroom concept. And I mean, that's a whole other topic for a whole other video. I think one thing that they brought up that has really stuck with me is the publicity of washrooms, public washrooms. And I feel like what I was told growing up was like, a washroom is such a private space. You don't want to intermix with other people of your own gender, let alone another gender. But now we've created these very private spaces in a lot of our facilities. Whereas the new trends of washroom design are moving more towards open spaces, and that there is safety in numbers.
Totally agree with you. I mean, I think to keep it short from my perspective, recently I was at Waterton, which is a national park here in Alberta, and they recently rebuilt the visitor center. It burned down during a fire back in 2018. And during that redesign, they did make an effort to make one large, massive washroom with individual stalls with doors that go all the way to the ground. And then they're gender non-specific, but it's based on whether you need a toilet or a urinal or a change table. So it's probably 20 of these vestibules. And that's not something that I'm unfamiliar with, having been to many pools that do something like that, or even baseball stadium in town. They couldn't afford to do a whole bunch of washrooms, so they did a trailer with some washrooms like this. And the person I was visiting the visitor center with was open to using the washrooms, but just completely perplexed on how, like, they'd never seen a washroom where you had to pick based on, do you want a urinal or a toilet? The sort of the interaction with other people in the space, it was really interesting to see. There was nothing negative about it. They just didn't know how to use the space, right? And I can only imagine somebody who might be older or from another country or lacking language skills. It could go completely south in terms of how people use the space. Okay, well, that's all I had. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think those were, like I said, as I kind of reflected, those were the big points that kind of kept coming back in my head. And it's an interesting topic, and I think it is probably one that could have a lot of research into it. And I would be really interested to know the statistics behind it. But until some researcher does that, I think we'll stick with what we can kind of anecdotally tell ourselves.
And I think the hard part with statistics, as I'm hearing increasingly from another set of interviews that I've been doing in terms of statistics for safety, I think it's a tough one, because a lot of, especially let's say a for-profit business, because there's a water park mentioned in the original article, it's threading that needle of disclosure, but then also not coming across as a target or a high-profile location where many of these things happen, which may result in parents being unwilling to send their kids to that location. Or, like, it's just, I don't know how you thread that needle exactly either, because we want honest reporting, but how many people are going to honestly report that out, except to the authorities?
Municipality to municipality, I know reporting structures and what reports are filled out and where they go, like, it's all different. So trying to find an actual data set would be a challenge for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here.